My name is Timothy Baum, a very long-term associate with James Mayer of the Mayer Gallery, and one of our mutual passions has always been the subject of Surrealism. And in the past, actually all the way back to 1974, we have done a variety of rather amazing shows connected to Surrealism, particularly with Man Ray, which was our first show literally 50 years ago in 1974. But this is the year of the 100th anniversary of the beginning of Surrealism, and it's being celebrated in different ways, more in Paris, where Surrealism began, than in other countries. I'm from New York, and I'm pretty much the main Surrealist expert or Surrealism expert in America, but I also am very involved with putting exhibitions together. But because of my affinity to James and his gallery, I decided to do this show in London with him and not in New York, where I more frequently do shows in various places. So what we have here is an exhibition that shows the work of maybe 40 different Surrealist artists, where to the average person, if you say the word Surrealism, they say, oh, you mean Salvador Dali, that kind of thing? And the answer is yes, that kind of thing. But who else do you know besides Salvador Dali? I don't expect you to be an expert. Oh, well, Magritte, okay. And Marcel Duchamp, okay. And I said it usually stops, maybe let's put Man Ray in as well, but that's about where it stops. I'm gonna walk around a little bit and show you marvels done by people you've never possibly heard of, but they were all very important members of the Surrealist group. And the Surrealist group, which is one way that its founder, Henri Breton, described it to be as a group. Unlike Cubism or abstract expressionism or any ism, Surrealism began in 1924, and for me it lasted until Henri Breton himself passed away, which was in 1967. So right there you have 40 plus years of a group, a movement that never disintegrated. They stayed together all that time, and their activities never ceased. And when the war came, there was more going on in New York relating to Surrealism, because a lot of their artists ended up there. But as soon as the war was over, back to Paris, begin where they left off. So that's the background of why we're doing this show in celebration of the 100th birthday of the Surrealist Movement. And as we said in the title of the show, Surrealism 1924-Forever, because it ain't going away. I'll just start with, this happens to be the largest work in this show, and this is by the only main or major Swiss surrealist called Seligman. And Seligman, when he came to Paris, he was just noticed by Henri Breton and his friends quite soon, because his subject matter, it was different from anybody else. And if you think of the great artists, particularly in the 20th century, there was just certain ones where it's almost like they just put their stake in the ground, and they presented a certain body of work where nobody else would dare try to imitate them or outdo them, because they couldn't be duplicated. And so the same as, you can say that with, Leger or even Chagall, or Kandinsky, of all the other well-known artists of the century. But these guys really came up with their own little niche. So Seligman, he does these wonderful, strange conglomeration of figures that only occurred in his imagination. Nobody else would have ever thought of this. He has, it's like his own personal mythology, and nobody would get near it, so that's his place. Surrealists worked in every kind of technique and medium. So in the world of collage, they produced some of the really great, most imaginative collage artists of all time. These two works here are by a surrealist called Georges Huniet, Hugnet. And Georges Huniet, he liked to play with erotic subjects, but not to harm you, but just to sort of, challenge you a little bit with just interesting combinations. And back here, we have one more work by him, and this is a category that he invented of the poem collage. So he's also a very good surrealist poet, put the two talents together, only instead of hand writing a poem and then doing a collage, he would cut out a lot of words. He would then make a poem out of his cut out words, suited to an image, and the result would be something wonderful like that. And he's probably the only person who ever did that, but if he isn't the only one, he's the first one. This is about 1935. So, and Surrealism, as I said before, began in 1924. The 30s might have been their richest decade, and then the war came and interrupted it. But in that period, they did all sorts of explorations. During that period, Picasso begged to join them because he was so impressed and interested in their activities. But he was only allowed to stay for a year or so because he also, at the time, was very involved with communism. And Breton, who had also, as a young man, sort of, given some thought to communism and Karl Marx and all that, he decided, no, that's not for me or France or Paris. But certain people like Picasso stuck with it. So here he is, maybe the most famous artist of the 20th century, and yet he only lasted a year with the Surrealists because of their strong differences of opinion. But we do have a great Picasso. This is an etching, and etchings are done on a copper or zinc plate, but it's a drawing which then gets printed and usually in an edition. But this is an etching which he did, I think, to show Salvador Dali, who was getting a lot of praise at the time, that whatever Dali could do, he could do as well. And there was a printer called the Courier in Paris, where both Dali and Picasso did the printing of their etchings. So he went to Le Courier and said, I'd like to do an etching with you, a surrealist etching. Oh, wonderful. And he said, I'd like to print it myself. I don't know, I'm not, really a professional, but I'd like to do it myself. So the result was this etching, and it's the only one he did. When Le Courier, who was very charmed by it, said, are you thinking to do an edition, or have your gallery do an edition? He said, no, I just want that. And then he wrote, Éprouve d'état tiré par moi, Picasso, which means this is a singular proof, pulled, meaning printed by me, Picasso. So even though it's surrounded by, unique works, drawings, collages, paintings. It's just as unique, and that's the year where he was, enjoined with the big Surrealists, and then by the next year he was not. So that's of a special importance. In terms of drawing, de Chirico, his rather amazing paintings of the First World War time were considered ideal to the Surrealists, and one could say that he was sort of the father of Surrealism in a way. But Surrealism began, 6 years after the war had ended. He'd already stopped doing his first series of paintings, but then in the 20s, he began to do a new series, and one of his favorite subjects was this, what he called an archaeological couple, representing, endless time, let's say. And this maybe is the greatest drawing he ever did during that period. And then the person who owned this, who had tremendous respect for this work, he had the ingenuity to go to his framer and said, "You see this little area, this little architectural little building? So I want to make a frame that corresponds to that. So therefore, look, can't beat it for, beauty. You could hang that, in the Sistine Chapel, and it would fit right in. But anyway, so that's really Surrealist nobility on its highest level. So that is a rather idealized, beautiful portrait of André Breton, done by one of the great lady Surrealists, Valentine Hugo. And Valentine Hugo was really only known in France until maybe 10 years ago. She never had an exhibition. She adored Breton for having brought her into the group, with such admiration. And then they had a very close friendship. So this is one of a few portraits she did of him. I mean, her ability to draw is, the highest level. It's a lovely immortalization of him as well as the young thinker, dreamer that he was. And this is a little object made by André Breton, who was basically one of the great French poets of his time, but he liked to play around with collage. And if he would find some little object that he found fascinating, as he did this little pink penknife that he might have found in the street or whatever, so he put that on a card, and then he wrote a little poem, his way of viewing that, which would not be anyone else's way, and that becomes a poem object. And he did maybe 15 or 16 of those. Most of them are in museums, but we were lucky, Mr. Mayor and I, to happen to have the opportunity to acquire that. So where most people would not jump with joy to acquire that little thing, we jump for joy. A painting by one of the original Surrealists called André Masson, and this painting happens to be from 1924, the first year of Surrealism. So it's particularly nice to have that as a starting point. And Masson, very good painter, great imagination. This painting is called The Mask, and it seems to be on a table with a glass and a playing card in a room, but a room where there just happen to be a few clouds floating by, a surrealist room, shall we say. A really great example of surrealist ingenuity, where Man Ray, who's best known as a great photographer, portrait photographer, etc., the inventor of the rayograph. But he also loved to do objects, and he also had a very great imagination. So here, he just simply took a piece of brown sandpaper and put a little paste gem in the sky and drew a horizon line and a little bit of shadow and called it étoile de verre, where étoile de mer is a starfish, but étoile de verre is simply a glass star. And that's that wonderful thing. But just done quickly, where his mind said, oh, if I do that, I can get that. Magritte, who more people know than a lot of these other artists, he painted in oil, but he actually was a better painter in gouache. I think with a little brush, he was much more precise than with the bigger brush. And in the late 20s, he did a series of these word paintings where he would pick random everyday objects, and then he would change the title. So instead of calling that a bowler hat, it became La Neige, snow. The lady's black shoe became the moon. This hammer became the desert. That was his imagination. And Surrealism is all about imagination. So that's a gouache by Magritte. And there's no museum that wouldn't be happy to have it if they had the money to maybe, write a check. Paul Éluard was the other major Surrealist poet beside Breton. And he also made quite nice collages. So in this case, he wrote one of his lovely little poems, and then he just made this tiny little collage where he just adds a couple of elements. And that's, a perfect little souvenir of the Surrealist mind. Naja, the most surrealist book ever written by a surrealist in particular, is Henri Breton's book called Naja, N-A-D-J-A. And Naja was a lady that he met completely by chance. He was totally infatuated with her, and they had a very brief, as it turned out, relationship, because she turned out to be really a very bizarre lady that I think it was beyond his ability to control, and he liked to be able to control situations, but she led him on a certain kind of voyage that was beyond his imagination completely. And she also did drawings, and this is a drawing, a self-portrait of her, where she's put the emphasis on her lips perhaps, which means you can kiss me, but don't try to figure me out. And so she closes her eyes and lets him, look at her lips all day, but don't think you're getting in here. This continues with different surrealists. This guy is definitely not known by many people, called Baskin, and that's a little painting he did of muses having a little night out on the town or whatever. This is where we began with that painting by Mr. Seligman, the Swiss surrealist. His drawings are very much exciting in the same way as the paintings. This is an English surrealist from the 30s and 40s, and it might be a self-portrait, we wouldn't know, but this, instead of painting on canvas, drawing and painting combined, she put silk on the canvas and then did this very mysterious kind of work. So that's very beautiful and very, let's say private. And then in terms of privacy, as you call it, and I say privacy, Leonore Feeney, she used women more than men as her subjects, and particularly women in deep emotional kind of states. So these two ladies constitute a picture to which she gave the title, The Damned, and that's probably because they had their relationship when that wasn't exactly fashionable or even discussable in society, so they would be damned. But there's something so haunting and great about that. Bellmayr was a German surrealist, and he had built for him life-size dolls. They had interchangeable parts, and he would dress them or put them in specific settings, and he would photograph them. So this particular doll is just sort of laying back on a chair in a room with a floral. But he would also have the doll in a tree, or he might have the doll in a garden, or he might have the doll in almost any kind of setting, but that was his realm, was the doll, which in French is la poupée, so that was his thing. Max Ernst, who is a German surrealist as well, very famous one. From childhood on, his greatest dream was to be a bird and to be able to fly. So he ended up creating creatures that were sort of part bird, part human, and this is called the bird family, and that's his little world of fantasy. Man Ray, who I mentioned before as maybe the greatest portrait photographer in the 20th century, beside his other talents. He photographed all of his surrealist friends, and then sometimes in groups, but he did at least one really good formal portrait of almost every one of them. And here is just a group of just surrealist poets. Again, Andre Breton, in his 20s when he founded Surrealism, and this is Mr. Aragon, Louis Aragon, who was sort of his right-hand man. That's the year that Surrealism began, and these were guys in their 20s, but very elegant, sophisticated young men. And Paul Éluard, who we saw before, the little collage with the poem, he was the next one in line. That's a more obscurely known poet called Ribaumont de Sand. But this was the inner group. And then there were two more poets of that initial group. Mr. Perret, a young man called Crevel, who unfortunately ended up to be very disillusioned, partially because of the Spanish Civil War, partially because of other things. So he unfortunately took his life at 35 years old, but he was a great poet until he was, till his last day probably. Surrealist poet called Lisa d'Armes. She is only wearing this strange combination of pearls and a funny hat made out of twigs and whatever, because she was in a film that was being made at her country house by Man Ray, and it was sort of in a remote part of the countryside, and Man Ray's camera broke down, so the film never got completed. But there are just little remnants like that to bring back, memories of that lost weekend. And finally, this is by a Romanian surrealist called Jacques Herold, who came to Paris in the 30s and stayed. And this is sort of, I mean, it's called a tarot, meaning like a tarot card, but it's much more than that. It's all of the people that he and many of the Surrealists really emulated, which is quite a strange combination of people. We have Freud, because they really admired his studies about the dreams, and then Pancho Villa, the great rebel from Mexico, Baudelaire, the great poet, Hegel, the great thinker, and Marquis de Sade, the great naughty boy, all together. And then he did a little symbol for each one. So that's like a little mini world in itself. And it says in just the inner circle, love, amour, revolution, and dream as the key words, and connaissance, and people you knew who were like you. But love, revolution, and the dream, so that's what it's all about. And everything we've just discussed touches on those subjects. And there are subjects that really the Surrealists, took command of much more than any other group of writers or thinkers, particularly the dream part. So that together makes Surrealism. We've assembled in these glass-top tables all sorts of souvenirs, let's say, of that period, including the old magazines, including wonderful original manuscripts. This is a poem by Breton, and that's a little book where that poem was first published just as a little pamphlet. And then here's a lovely manuscript poem by Mr. Eluard. This is a book that Man Ray did with Eluard's poems and the photographs, which are quite wonderful and very beautifully designed in the book, of the wife of Eluard, who was called Nouche, and she was at the time Picasso's favorite model, as well as Eluard's wife. So that's one of the great books of the 1930s. This is a very informal photograph of André Breton with Paul Eluard just on summer holiday, and they're like two mischievous boys just, having a happy time together. André Breton also was very knowledgeable about astrology, so he made horoscopes of almost everybody he knew. So that's one of his horoscopes here, studied and drawn out. Just quickly, again, Paul Eluard, who was a poet every second, the moment he woke up to the moment he died, but the whole life. So his first wife was called Gala. They met when they were young. These are all poems he wrote for her. He mounted it in a little special presentation and inscribed it to her. And so these are all just real souvenir. These are little tiny surrealist sayings, which are all quite, bizarre. And they would be handed out in the street as people came home from work, coming out of the metro or whatever, and some very well-dressed surrealists would be handing these out instead of free candies or something. This is something a little more somber. That's the announcement of Paul Eluard's death, which was it was a day of national mourning in France, because he was really considered one of the great poets, and France is certainly one of the countries that most appreciates poets, and then on a high level. And then finally, over here, I did most of this sort of assembling on my own. So these are documents relating to the great Surrealism exhibition in London in 1936, which created a lot of new Surrealist artists who transformed their work to a more surrealist kind of adventure. So that was the bulletin that came out in conjunction with that show. That's a list of the lectures that were given by various surrealists, both French and English, at the time of that 1936 show. The London Bulletin was concentrated more on surrealism than anything else, but that's the final number. And there they put it, it was all surrealist, except for maybe one or two. La Révolution Surréaliste was the first surrealist magazine. It started in 1924 when surrealism itself began. That continued for 2 or 3 years. No, actually for 4 years. And then other magazines succeeded it. This is an example of surrealist ingenuity where Andre Breton, somebody brought this photograph to him of this perfectly ordinary secretary sitting at a desk, but she's writing, but she's also looking in a different direction. And Breton was obsessed with the idea of automatic writing, which meant that you just started to write and you didn't hesitate. Whatever came out, that was it. So he was so enchanted by that photograph that the next issue of the Révolution Surréaliste, that was the cover. So these transformations they just happened quickly, and that was a final statement. So for my final statement, I can only say that since I was, in school days, time of my life, once I discovered surrealism, I never found anything again that was that exciting in terms of culture. I mean, I liked pop art in the 60s, that was fun. And other things are fun or interesting, but this was extraordinary. So I devoted my whole adult life to many things, but primarily this subject. And James Mayer of the Mayer Gallery, he joins me completely in the same level of enthusiasm, so that's why the show is taking place here. And I certainly urge you to come and enjoy it, because you will really benefit from the experience. So, nice talking to you. Thank you very much.